Hi, and thank you for staying with us through the last talk of the day to talk a little bit about structuring web content and using taxonomies to create themes across your website that can help us to present our services in a more user-centered way. I'm glad I followed the previous talk. It's different. We're not talking about customizing in the same way, but we are talking about trying to anticipate our users' kind of anticipate their needs and their context. Let's see if this works. Oops, sorry, I'm using a new way of doing this, so I'm going to go back. Here we go. Okay, so first, to give you some context, I want to tell you a little bit about who we are, and I have to mention my collaborator on this project, Eka Gregoric, who is Canadian, by the way. And she's an NCSU Libraries Fellow, and she's been working with the web team on information architecture and interaction design projects during her fellowship with us. Eka brought a lot of discipline knowledge and language of narrative taxonomy to this content structuring work that I'm going to share with you today. So try to pretend with me that she's here with me today. She's going to be presenting at LIDA next month for the both of us. So we are a web team of 3.5 now, and we were 2.5 until about 2 months ago, so small team, but with lots of IT resources sort of around us and other departments. So there's myself and Eka, who focus on project management, IA, content strategy, and that kind of thing, and we have 2 front-end developers, Eric Olson and Matthew O'Connell. Shout out to them in case they're listening. And they are brilliant at design implementation, doing our Drupal views and theming, and helping us with CMS data integration. So we have decentralized content creation, although there is a lot of oversight and management from the web team, but we do have 60+ folks who have their fingers in our website in one way or another, so our challenge is often to build ways for them to participate in the website and the content creation in ways that and make sure that they understand the ways that their contributions are affecting the integrity of the site as a whole. And we have a culture that supports very agile, iterative development, and web development and product development. And as you'll see in some of these examples, we experiment a lot. And so what you'll see today is kind of a live playground, some of what I'm going to show you. We are, as a team and as an organization, we are boldly user-centered. We care a lot as an organization, if you know about any of our work around innovative learning spaces, about facilitating those cross-channel experiences where our users start with us often in the physical space and then have to finish a transaction or set of transactions with us online, or vice versa. They would start online to reserve a room or to find out whether a laptop is available or any number of things, and then finish their work with us in an in-person experience somehow. We also care a lot about leveraging the real power of our CMS. From the beginning of using Drupal, we knew we didn't want to use it as just a container for HTML. We wanted to really find the power in it and in building relationships between content that were meaningful to users. So in talking about structuring web content, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think some of these things are important to acknowledge, that structuring web content is hard, and it can look deceptively easy. And it's hard because web content is often not born structured. We deal with a lot of legacy content, or we deal with people who write content about what they're doing, and we have these narratives that then we have to sort of translate into a structured presentation. So applying a structure to existing content is hard. It takes a lot of work to do it with the level of granularity that we need to do really interesting things. We're sometimes not sure what our narrative is, or what our users' narratives are, so we get tangled up and lose sight of the purpose of the work, or it's hard to know whether the work is worth the effort when you get into it and it gets really hard. And sustainability issues are very real. New structure requires new workflows, and that's a very different kind of challenge than the other kinds of web work that we do, and it requires library-wide buy-in, and it requires others to help form those workflows. Also, often we start with one structuring goal and we become more granular as we see possible relationships between attributes at different levels, and then we've sort of opened this Pandora's box that takes on a life of its own. But when you decide to do it and you start to look for structure, you begin to see it everywhere, and you can't unsee it, and then you're sort of caught up in this sort of swirling tornado of this thing. So what we do is we look for structure in existing content, and then we create fielded content types around that. And sometimes that means assembling additional content in fields that we don't have in a consistent way before. And then we try to expose interesting relationships to our users and apply taxonomies. And this is the part that I think a lot of us are accustomed to doing fielded content types, but learning to use taxonomies in cool ways is a lot of fun, and it's sort of worth it to dig into that. And we do that to create these content themes that go across our entire site. And just to give a nod to the iterative design process, this is a familiar iterative design cycle. We do use this approach because we see building taxonomies as a design thinking kind of project. Here are some of the content types that we have in place on our site. We've created detailed structures for information about our staff, our events and workshops, our spaces, our devices at a very granular level. And we're working on building a content type for generating metadata about learning objects like tutorials and documentation and other self-learning tools that can be related to these other kinds of content. So then what do we do in this process? Breaking this down a little bit more. First, we determine what is the entity that we're describing. Again, sounds deceptively simple. That's not always easy to determine. Is it a workshop you're describing, or is it an instance of a workshop? Do we need to describe an input cable as a separate device if we're building device lending nodes, or is the input cable an attribute of another, the existence of that cable is an attribute of another device? They're going to go together. Is a space an attribute of a workshop, or is it a separate entity that requires its own content type? And that depends. Will we ever talk about spaces in ways that are not related to workshops or events? And do we want to be prepared for that possibility, even if we can't imagine what it will look like now? So once we've determined what entity we're describing, then we need to list everything we know about it, its attributes. We know about attributes of things, but what we're suggesting is being exhaustive. Be as granular as possible. We're often afraid of granularity. And this leaves opportunities open. You can always aggregate later, but you'll probably never go back and touch all of that content at that granular level again. So we're suggesting an approach to modeling web content that is driven by a desired user experience. So imagine the experience that you want to create, or the particular outcome, more specifically for your users, and then explore what you know about the entities that would be present in the user transaction or set of transactions. So every entity has a story, it has a narrative, and it should be a piece of the library's story. But more importantly, users should see how it fits into their own stories. So the library's story here is that we have Mac laptops that you can borrow from these places for these amounts of time, and they have these software applications on them, and we can help you get one if you ask us. And oh, by the way, we have other kinds of laptops too. If you look at the breadcrumbs there. The user story, where we need to intersect, is my professor told me to use GarageBand for my multimedia assignment, and I don't have to worry because the library has it on the laptops that I can check out. And yep, that looks like the kind of laptop I'm used to using, and I don't need to rush because there are plenty of computers available right now at Hunt Library that I can use, so I'm going to grab some food first. I just need to go to the Ask Us desk and get one of those. And the overall story, the message here from the library is, what we hope the user takes from this is, the library understands what I need and makes it easy for me to know about it and use it. We're already doing a lot of these pieces, but what we think of as our services are things like laptop lending and the components of this, the making these things available, those are our services. But what we're trying to do is make connections with what it is that our users need to do. So when we start with the atomic entity, like in this case a single device, then and tell its story. Then we can aggregate those stories and create paths for users. So here the story is simpler. The library has laptops, and they have more than one kind, and oh, look at that, I can borrow them, and oh crap, the good ones I can't borrow for more than 4 hours. Wait, back up here, hold on, sorry. And then altogether, these entities tell a story of a service that we offer. So ultimately, we're talking about this service of technology lending. But we're talking about a process of thinking from the bottom up. And then finding relationships means thinking about, are there other related entities? Is there related data that could be exposed? And then we create entity references to expand the narrative. So back on this device node, a list of software is displayed here. Software is a separate entity with its own content type and its own attributes. And I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead here. There we go. And in our Drupal fields list for software, we can see that the software has fields that are entity references that allow us to relate a software title to specific devices or spaces. So this is a software node for a specific software title. So notice that this view also displays what spaces you can use this software in. If you scroll down farther, you could see, well, actually we tell you what devices and that you can use it on, that it's on all of our lendable MacBooks. And then also, if you notice that told you what spaces, if you linked into our music rooms at Hunt Library, then there is another entity for spaces, and we can use an entity reference to connect the software to a space entity. And then if a user found the space node first, either by searching or by a path that took them to the space node, then we're exposing the software nodes there on the space node as well. So this is another kind of entity. This is Karen. Karen has a story. We know where she works, we know how to contact her, we know what her professional interests are. For every entity, we want to tell its story and to look for the intersections, again, with our user stories. How does Karen's story intersect with the user's story? Their subject interests, their classes they're taking. Does Karen look like she would be nice and easy to talk to about chemistry? Also, if you take a look at this little bit on the right side of the page, Karen is associated with a library story, which is a branding that we use for a kind of feature stories about the ways that librarians collaborate with faculty and users to do cool things. So you could click into that and find out what Karen's doing in that way. And then the person entity can be aggregated to tell a story about a group of people who do a particular kind of work. This all looks familiar, right? But when you start to think about the fact that we can pull anything that we tag or that we attach this person to up onto the department pages, then we can find out, we can aggregate on a department page all of the projects or all of the workshops that people in that department deliver and put those together in ways, because we can create these entity references. So, and also here, part of the story is, even the fact that we value consistency in our staff photos, while also encouraging some personality, might tell you something about our values that you wouldn't get from just seeing a single staff page or seeing a directory list. So, revisiting that list of content that we saw earlier, we have a lot of great content now that's well maintained about all of these things. So how do we organize all of these things to show users how they're relevant to what they need to do? So what we're really talking about is presenting the services that we offer. But what are services? So we tend to use the word services and services menus and services landing pages as kind of a dumping ground for a hodgepodge of links to content that talks about the way we organize our work or about what cool projects we're working on that we hope users will see and use. And we use language that organizes information about how we administer our services. So Tamara Adlin would call this, she does a lot of work on personas and user stories, she would call this the showing our corporate underpants. This is one of my favorite examples of a services page. I apologize if you recognize this as yours. And it's one of my favorite examples of how we've bloated our services list. I just took this screenshot 2 days ago, so this is real. There are 59 items on this list with a helpful little note at the bottom that you can't see here to say that if you can't find what you need here, you can just ask a subject specialist. Jenny Reddish, in Letting Go of the Words, which is worth reading from beginning to end, even though it seems like it's more of a reference book, tells us over and over again that we have to have the conversation that our users want to have. They don't start their conversation with, what is the full range of services that your library offers to help me with anything that I might need to do? They start with problems like, I need to make a video for a class project. My professor told me you have cameras I can borrow, but I've never used one before, ... That's where you pick up, right? Or my grant agency requires a data management plan, or at least says I should know what one is. What the hell is that, and how much work is that going to be if you're a faculty member? So our users make things and do things. Librarians provide things that help them do and make. And so what we want to do is to start thinking in terms of the products that our users need to deliver in their own lives, and think of our services as those things that help them generate those products. And so what we do is provide spaces, technology, human expertise in the form of help, consultations, instruction, instructional content for self-learning sometimes. So I propose that that our services are very few, and that we sort of really bloat this idea of services, and that really when we think about user services, they're very few. They are those things that are these sort of delivering of the things that help users do what they want to do. So when you start to break this down even more and think about, so what do users make? And I like thinking about this in terms of making because it makes you focus on the product. So we started to flesh out this idea using content that was easy to think of in terms of products. They make videos, they make photographs, they make web pages, they make posters, they make 3D prints and scans, they laser cut things, they make wearable electronics. We have a design school, so they actually make a lot of wearable electronics. Then we took this a little bit further to see if we could use this model for research activities. Now, I lost a battle on that collections once, so try to pretend that's not there. Users also make citation lists and data management plans and grant applications and data visualizations. They write papers and they do some other things. So we're working on a piece of this that will get at undergraduate research and learning and the products that come out of that. We haven't gotten there yet. So all this becomes a user activities taxonomy that looks something like this. And there are other kinds of user activities. So as mentioned, we're working on that undergraduate piece. That's a big missing piece in this experiment. And then let's look at what that allows us to do. So here, if we take the product, some sort of audio recording, and we decide that that's the content that is about what the user needs to do, and we keep the focus in the main content area on this node or page on the user's need, and make the presentation of our services relevant to that user's particular context, wrap it around the presentation of the need. Then the user, hopefully, can quickly identify themselves with the main content on the page and then see how we can support them. Let's see. There's a number of things here. So they can see that we have these workshops coming up. Maybe something there is relevant. If you scroll down on this page, you can see the spaces for this kind of work. If you click through, you can find out whether you have to reserve those spaces and so on. Audio equipment that can be used in the libraries, and then that second category is what we have that's available for you to borrow and take wherever you need it to be. Further up on the previous slide, you saw friendly-looking people who look cool and like you wouldn't mind approaching them to ask for help. At least that's what we hope. So we do this by creating a node for each device and applying a taxonomy field that allows the people who manage the equipment to associate it with various things that users might do. This is cool because this is what that field looks like in Drupal. It's just it's a taxonomy in the structure in Drupal. You just create a taxonomy. I say just create, but coming up with these terms is not trivial. because that granularity issue becomes an issue, and lots of people care about this. But the beauty of this is that its maintenance can be very decentralized. So Kyle, who manages our music rooms and sound studios, knows the most about this kind of equipment, so he maintains this data. He opens the box, he puts the equipment into production use, and then he creates the node for this piece of equipment and attaches that goes in, and in the form that we give him to talk about this piece of equipment, he can attach the user activity taxonomy term. And so he's the one who's telling us how users might be able to use this. I don't have to know anything about this particular kind of microphone and how users might use it. Kyle knows that. He can put that in. I just give him a tool to be able to do that. And so the site architecture, and Kyle doesn't really even have to know how it's going to be displayed. He just knows that he needs to make these associations. And then the site architecture takes care of pulling them together. So this same taxonomy is tied to each of these content types, and we can then present context-relevant items from any of these types along with the information about what the user is trying to do. The result are what we call do pages. They're actually at a URL/do, and that dynamically present all of the resources that we can provide about a user activity. So this is an example of another do page. You just saw the audio one. And by the way, we got this do language just happens to kind of work out as a riff off of our university's new branding campaign called Think and Do, so wasn't that convenient? And then these pages can aggregate up to landing pages, again, that help us create those paths for our users if they don't know the specifics or if they just do want to see what we can do for them in the category of digital audio. They aggregate up to these landing pages, and then we can aggregate the related content. So on a page like this one that pulls together all of those user activities into this category, we can aggregate the workshops so that they show all of the digital media workshops and not just the ones that are relevant to audio. And so that's kind of the gist of the user activities taxonomy and how that plays out. And then we're beginning to look at another kind of taxonomy because we never quite finish one thing before we dive into something else where we are. And so we're beginning to look into this other kind of taxonomy that's more of a business taxonomy. And there's some literature about this idea of business taxonomy, and that's more common, that uses what we do as librarians to build our story for different audiences, for other audiences. So in this case, this is Jason, and Jason, he's awesome. He's also a very good presenter. And Jason is, so he's like my hero when it comes to that sort of thing. Jason is a prolific presenter on digital library projects, and we can see that from his page. He doesn't have all the things that Karen had there because they're not relevant. He's not a public-facing person in our library. But you also see this, that there's a link on his page to another one of those library stories that I mentioned. And then if we click down into that, we can see that Jason does the technical work to support a program that encourages faculty to create digital alternatives to textbooks. And if we scroll down on that page, then we can see that Jason is a collaborator on this story, on this project, and we can see who else was involved. So if I'm interested in the copyright aspects of this, or I want to know who's in charge, and I want to talk to the person who's sort of heading up this project, I can follow the link to find out more about Will Cross and how to contact him. And then I'm going to get to Will's page, and oh look, Will has had a role in some other stories, and he can also in stories projects, and he can also help me with managing my research data, among other things. So altogether, these relationships between types of content help to tell another layer of the library's story. So this is a separate taxonomy that we would be using from the user activities taxonomy that ties together, but each taxonomy can be tied to any of these kinds of content if we determine that it's relevant. So ECA has been working on a project to mine content like news stories, events, our intranet, departmental project pages, those staff professional development pages, to look for themes in what we're talking about across the libraries. So then we'll try to use the same process to create this business taxonomy that can be used to enhance our story for other audiences like campus administrators, potential employees, prospective faculty and students, library colleagues, But the users come first, so we'll keep working on getting the user activities taxonomy right for now. And then we'll kind of keep working on this in the background and keep looking for those opportunities to bring these things together. And that is what I have right here. Any questions?
How do you go about making taxonomy decisions? So, for example, I noticed that at the highest level you had events, but then you also had workshops, and couldn't a workshop be an event?
Mm-hmm. That's a very interesting question. So actually events and workshops are not taxonomy words. They're separate content types. They used to be a single content type, so we don't like to proliferate content types if it doesn't make sense to do that. So initially we created, we were very judicious about that in the beginning, and we just said workshops are a type of event, and we can tag them. We can put away in the, we can field it so that we can tag them as workshops, and then we can pull them out and do feeds of workshops and present them separately. Until people started offering series of workshops that needed to be presented, and we needed to be able to do some different things with them and attach them to things in different ways. So we just recently we've been working with that events content type with workshops for probably 3 years, and then we just recently pulled workshops out. But the question about how we make those taxonomy decisions is an interesting one. We usually on the web team kind of have the expertise to kind of drive the decisions about whether something needs its own content type and how granular that needs to be, just because we have the best view of the entire site structure and how that can work. But when it comes to making taxonomy decisions about things like user activities, then you have to engage. It has to be a broader conversation. So the way we try to do that, and the way I would advise that, is to have your team dig in and read a little bit about taxonomy and how to apply it at a higher level, a conceptual level, and make the first pass or 2 or 3 at what you think a taxonomy might look like. If you know your organization and you know your content, you probably have the best overall window into how to do that. But then you have to broaden the conversation. You have to bring in the people who manage those services. And what I found that works really well, is to not get 15 people who not look at all those user activities and find the 15 people. I've been in, design committees with 15 people, and then try to iterate on them together, because everybody's coming at it from a different place. But to bring people in 2 or 3 at a time. So have your team of 2 or so, who've really dug into this, and then bring people in like a couple at a time, and then iterate on it, almost in a card sorting kind of way, but with people who really know the content, because that's who you're working with. I don't know if that helps. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to say first that I really admire the work that you guys do. I spoke with Corey Lone probably 5 years ago, and was pretty blown away at the thoughtful approach that you guys take to user experience and discovery.
Thank you. I'll pass that on to Corey.
Yeah, and you guys, anyway, I'm not going to turn this into yeah. Anyway, big fan. Can you tell me a little bit about the direction that you guys are getting from upper management and the staffing? Because I know that you guys do take a thoughtful approach. So how do you guys organize your team and priorities?
Let's see if I can think about how to approach that. I think we have an organization that hires people that they trust to exercise their expertise. So that's immensely helpful and important. But we do have some very interested and active administrators who allow us to kind of, like this process of thinking about taxonomy and learning to use Drupal taxonomy for the first time. We started thinking about this and talking about it a couple of years ago, probably, and there's a little bit of social engineering, and there's a lot of opportunity and encouragement to reach out to people across the organization. So it's a very collaborative work environment, and so I can reach out and pull 2 or 3 people together and have a conversation or talk about any of these ideas over lunch, or have a brown bag lunch and then say, hey, let's just talk about this thing we're thinking about doing. That's useful. It's always a little bit tricky to figure out. My administrators are listening. It's a little bit tricky to figure out how far out you build something before you open it up for kind of review. And so I feel like I get that right about 85% of the time. And then there are other times that I really just don't see it coming that the deputy director was going to feel very strongly about this particular decision that we made. So some of it is just accepting that this kind of work is fraught with those kinds of challenges. But some of it really is for us that we have a very forward-thinking administration. When we step out boldly to do something, if we can show them how it's relevant and back it up with arguments that sound well informed and with data, we do a lot of backing up our arguments with data. Then we find that we get administrative buy-in, and this was something, selling this user activity arrangement for some of this content and saying let's make it live and play with it. There was some reticence on the part of some department heads, and especially some of our research and information services staff, and I felt very, very good the other day when the head of research and information services, who has just been promoted to a position so that I'm now in his reporting line, said, sometimes I just look at those due pages and I just gaze at them just because, So, he's not basing that on anything, because honestly, there hasn't been a lot of user testing of this yet. We're about to do some of that and dig into this a little bit more. But we've been watching, and they're being used, and our staff who are working with users are finding them useful in dealing with users, and so that's really good. That's a good start. It's good feedback. Thanks. Okay.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you very. Oh, I've got a question here.
So this is all in Drupal. Have you experimented with allowing access to the data to be pulled into other things like your LMS or anything like that?
Yes. Let's see. We are pulling information about spaces into our room reservation system. So we see Drupal as the authoritative source for all information about spaces, except for that policy kind of information that has to be in the room reservation system for restricted use and that kind of thing. So as much as possible, we have a single authoritative source for any piece of data. Something that I've been pushing for years. We get a new we're using EMS for our room res system, and the web team helped build the interface, the new UI for that. And but back when we were talking about systems, I was saying, wait, we need to have people in the room who are talking about the data and where the data lives and where the data needs to go. And so we pull from our space nodes that are in Drupal, we pull basic information, the photos of the spaces that are used for understanding how those space, the utilitarian kind of photos, the descriptions, some basic information about spaces so that they're available in the grid when you're doing that. We also pull data into Drupal. We output data about events into the campus events system. I'm probably forgetting a whole bunch of things, but we also pull data into Drupal from our catalog. So that's how we get the circulation information. So we're pulling in, those are real-time kind of availability information about individual devices. If I go to the library, there are 2 MacBooks, so let me bust my butt and get over there and get one of those before it gets checked out. So yeah, and users really heavily use that availability data.
There's still time for one more question if you have a question you'd like to ask. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.